It was a crisp autumn afternoon in Central Park. The city's hum softened by the expansive greenery around it. For James Carter, a billionaire entrepreneur, it was a rare moment of quiet. The business world, with its demands and deadlines, felt a distant memory here. His book was open, but his mind, though engrossed, occasionally flickered back to the empire he had built, an empire that often left him no time for such peaceful moments. Still, in this park, beneath the shade of an oak tree, he was just another person seeking a brief respite from the chaos. The park, as usual, was bustling with life. Joggers passed by, families enjoyed their weekend picnics, and the occasional sound of children laughing filled the air. James was content, though, to simply sit on the weathered bench, reading his novel. It was a luxury he rarely allowed himself, to simply be a man, unmarked by the wealth and status that usually defined him. A few yards away, Officer John Mitchell walked his usual beat. A veteran of the force, he had seen it all, the darker sides of human nature, but also its resilience. Today, like most days, he walked through the park, his eyes scanning for anything that felt out of place. The park was familiar, but there was always an underlying edge to the city that John couldn't ignore. Something always felt like it was on the brink of happening. His hand rested instinctively near his holster, a habit that kept him alert. As John walked past a bench occupied by a group of young men, laughing and drinking, his eyes briefly landed on James. The man was sitting alone, a well-dressed figure in an otherwise busy park. There was nothing overtly suspicious about him. He was calm, composed, reading a book, but something about him felt off. It was hard to put into words, but John's instincts told him this wasn't just another park visitor. He had seen wealthy individuals before, but they were almost always accompanied by bodyguards or entourages. The fact that this man was alone struck John as strange. The suspicion wasn't grounded in any clear evidence, but his gut told him to investigate further. A fleeting thought about a suspect in the area flashed through his mind. Without fully understanding why, John walked toward James. As John approached, James didn't look up immediately, still engrossed in his book. But as soon as he got closer, their eyes met. James didn't flinch or act startled. Instead, he simply nodded in acknowledgement, the calmness in his eyes unsettling John further. "Excuse me," John began, his voice steady but authoritative. "Mind if I ask what you're doing here?" James looked up from his book, offering a polite smile. "Just enjoying the day, officer. Reading a book." John's brow furrowed. The response was too calm, too casual. Most people either looked intimidated or defensive when approached by a police officer. But James was neither. He was, disturbingly, at ease. "I haven't seen you around here before," John said, his tone shifting slightly. "You from around here?" James smiled slightly, but didn't offer more. "Been around," he answered cryptically. The evasiveness sparked something in John. His suspicion deepened, his need to assert authority taking over. The man's dismissive tone rubbed John the wrong way. He wasn't sure why, but something about it made him want to press further. "I'll need to see some ID," John demanded, his voice firm now as he stood taller, trying to maintain control of the situation. James remained composed, not moving. "Am I under arrest, officer?" he asked calmly. The question made John's grip tighten on his radio. It was the challenge that pushed him further. His instincts flared, urging him to press, to prove himself in control. "You will be if you don't cooperate," John retorted, his hand resting a little too close to his gun. "I'm just sitting in a park," James replied, his voice still calm. "Is that a crime?" John's patience began to fray, despite the lack of any real cause. His gut told him that this man, who didn't react the way others would, was hiding something. His training had taught him that sometimes it was about asserting authority, maintaining control in situations where it felt like things were slipping away. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," John said, though the reason for this was shaky at best. He moved closer, his posture becoming more aggressive, trying to force an answer from James. James's gaze didn't waver. He knew what was coming. He had been in similar situations before, when assumptions about him were made based on his appearance. But this time, there was an odd calm in him. It wasn't fear that filled him, but something more familiar. The quiet recognition that this would escalate regardless of his response. "I'm asking again." John pressed, his voice lower now. "Show me your ID." James paused, his thoughts racing. The officer's demeanor had already shifted into something more aggressive, more confrontational, despite knowing his rights. He also understood how easily these things could spiral out of control. He had been in enough situations like this to know that refusing outright could lead to far worse consequences. "I'm not hiding anything," James said quietly, before slowly reaching into his jacket pocket for his wallet. John's eyes narrowed further, watching James's every movement like a hawk. His hand instinctively hovered near his gun, his training telling him to prepare for anything. When James finally handed over his ID, John snatched it from his hand and glanced at it quickly, though the name didn't immediately mean anything to him. "Get up," John ordered. "Turn around." James's movements were slow, deliberate. He stood, his hands visible and open, signaling no threat. He allowed John to cuff him, keeping his composure. The officer's unease was evident now. His hand shook slightly as he fastened the cuffs, though James remained calm throughout. The minutes dragged on as John led James toward the patrol car, the weight of the situation sinking in. Despite everything, James's calmness unsettled John further. This wasn't a typical encounter. There was something deeper at play here, but John couldn't quite figure out what it was. As the police car's tires crunched over the gravel, John stole a glance at James in the rearview mirror. He didn't know who he was dealing with, but the discomfort gnawed at him. James wasn't just any man. John didn't realize it yet, but soon he would find out just how wrong his assumptions had been. The police car's tires crunched over the gravel as it pulled into the precinct's parking lot. James Carter, despite the handcuffs digging into his wrists, remained as composed as ever. His thoughts, sharp as ever, were already running through the possible outcomes of the situation. He had dealt with this type of thing before, the profiling, the assumptions, the injustice of it all. But today, there was something different about it. Something felt personal. As the car came to a halt, Officer John Mitchell seemed more tense than ever. His knuckles were white around the steering wheel, and his shoulders were stiff. It wasn't just the arrest that weighed on him. There was a sense that something wasn't quite right, something he couldn't put his finger on. He had made a snap judgment. But now, as he guided James out of the car, his unease only grew. James, for his part, didn't react. He had been wrongly detained many times before. He knew the drill. He wasn't afraid of the cuffs, or the precinct, or the officers who might look at him with suspicion. He had faced the unfair assumptions of others for so long that it no longer bothered him. What bothered him was how easy it was for people to make assumptions about him based on his appearance, and how many times he had been forced to prove his innocence simply because of the color of his skin. As John led him through the precinct's busy halls, James could hear the buzz of activity, officers talking, phones ringing, footsteps echoing against the tile floors. But despite the noise, it was quiet in his mind. He was preparing himself for the next phase. The next stage of this process was inevitable. He would be questioned, and then he would be let go, because there was nothing to hold him for. There had never been anything to hold him for in the first place. When they reached the booking desk, Officer Jenkins, a younger officer, glanced up. His eyes flickered from James to the handcuffs and back again. He wasn't sure what was going on, but the moment he looked at James's face, a slight pause registered in his mind. There was something familiar about the man standing there, cuffed and calm, but Jenkins couldn't place it. "What's this about?" Jenkins asked, his voice tinged with confusion. John, still defensive, shrugged. "Caught this guy acting suspicious in the park. He wouldn't cooperate when I asked for ID." Jenkins glanced at the ID, then at James, his eyes widening slightly. The recognition came a moment too late, but it was there. James Carter. The name was suddenly more than just a name. It was a public figure, a businessman known throughout New York. Jenkins hadn't expected this, hadn't known who he was dealing with, but now, It was clear that something had gone wrong. Before Jenkins could say anything, John spoke up again, more defensively than before. "What? You've seen him around before, right?" he asked, though there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice now. Jenkins took a breath, glancing back at James. "I've heard the name, but I didn't know it was him. I just thought," he trailed off, realizing he had no idea what he thought. "Whatever," John muttered, shaking his head. "He's going to Captain Bennett's office. She'll handle it from here." James, still composed, didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He knew the process, knew the system, knew exactly how this would play out. He had been wrongfully arrested before, many times, and he had learned that in situations like this, silence was often the best response. The truth had a way of coming out on its own, and when it did, the real question would be who would be held accountable for the mistake. Captain Laura Bennett was seated at her desk, buried in paperwork, when the door to her office opened. She barely looked up, the noise of the precinct in the background still a constant hum. It was just another day, just another situation that would need her attention. But when John walked in, followed by James in handcuffs, she could sense the tension in the air. "What's this about, Robert?" Captain Bennett asked, her voice calm but direct, her eyes still focused on the papers in front of her. John shifted uncomfortably before speaking. "Caught this guy acting suspicious in the park. Wouldn't show ID when I asked." Captain Bennett looked up slowly, her eyes scanning James before they flickered back to John. There was something in her gaze, something that made James's experience of the situation shift just a little. She had seen his name before. She knew who he was. This wasn't a random man from the street. This was someone important, someone who had been wrongfully profiled. "Is that so?" Bennett asked, her voice now sharper. "Did you have probable cause to arrest him?" John hesitated. He wasn't ready for the scrutiny. His gut told him something wasn't right, but his pride and his training fought against him. "He fit the description of a suspect we're looking for," he said, his voice faltering slightly as he spoke. Captain Bennett raised an eyebrow. "And what description was that?" John stammered slightly. "Tall black male. Early 40s, he muttered, though his voice had lost some of its conviction. He was acting suspicious. Bennett's expression hardened as she looked at John. "A description that vague?" she asked. "Was that really enough to arrest someone?" John didn't respond. The weight of his decision pressed down on him, and for a moment, he realized how flimsy his justification had been. He had acted on instinct, on suspicion, nothing more. Bennett took a breath, her voice firm. "Please wait outside." "Robert," she ordered. "I'll speak with Mr. Carter alone." For a moment, John didn't move. He was still processing what had just happened, still grappling with his mistake. But when Bennett's cold gaze locked onto him, he stepped back reluctantly. He knew his pride had clouded his judgment, and it was only now that the full weight of his actions began to hit him. Inside the office, the atmosphere shifted. The door closed behind John, and Bennett's tone softened, though she was still firm. "Mr. Carter, I want to apologize for this misunderstanding," she said, her voice professional, but with an undercurrent of sincerity. James nodded, his expression neutral. "There's no need to apologize. Captain, you're just doing your job." Bennett sat back in her chair, rubbing her temples slightly. "I'm aware of who you are, Mr. Carter. I should have realized sooner. Robert made a mistake, and I'm going to ensure he's held accountable for it." James leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "I appreciate that, but it's not about me. It's about how these situations are handled, how many others are subjected to this same treatment." Bennett paused for a moment before responding. "You're right. It shouldn't matter who you are, but in some places, it does. That's something we need to address. But for now, I need to deal with this incident properly." She stood up, moving toward the door. "I'll take care of this, Mr. Carter. You're free to go once this is handled, but I'll be in touch. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again." James gave a slight nod. "I'll be waiting." The door closed behind Captain Laura Bennett, leaving Officer John Mitchell standing in the hallway, his thoughts clouded with confusion and regret. The weight of his actions, his snap judgment, sat heavy on his shoulders. The pride that had led him to profile a man based on mere suspicion was now coming back to haunt him. He had made a mistake that was about to cost him far more than he could have anticipated. Inside, the room felt oddly quiet. The bustling precinct seemed distant, almost muted, as if everything outside was irrelevant. The moment of reckoning had arrived. James Carter sat calmly, his wrists still sore from the handcuffs, but his expression steady. He had been through this many times before, being wrongfully accused, unjustly profiled. But each time it happened, the sting was just as sharp. He wasn't angry. He didn't expect justice to come easily. He had learned over the years to remain composed, to wait for things to unfold in their own time. Today, he was just waiting for the system to catch up with the truth. A few minutes later, the door opened again. Officer Robert Jenkins stepped inside, holding the papers from the booking desk in his hands. He glanced at James, still uncertain of how to approach the situation. But when their eyes met, there was a flicker of recognition. Jenkins had been the one to input James's information into the system earlier. He now understood who this man was, the same man he had just helped arrest, unaware of the consequences of his actions. "Mr. Carter," Jenkins said, his voice softer than before. I didn't realize who you were. I'm sorry for the confusion." His tone was apologetic, but there was a hint of unease in his eyes, as though he, too, was coming to terms with the situation. James nodded, acknowledging the officer's words, but saying nothing. He had no need to explain himself to someone who already knew the truth. He was here for one reason, to see that this incident, like so many others, would not be swept under the rug. The door to the office opened again, and Captain Bennett stepped in, her expression firm but respectful. She gave a slight nod to Jenkins, signaling him to step aside. She turned to James, offering a small, apologetic smile. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice steady but laced with sincerity. "I want to apologize once again for what happened today. This was an unfortunate misunderstanding, and I assure you, we are taking it seriously." She paused, as if gathering her thoughts. "This should not have happened, and I want to make sure it doesn't again." James met her gaze with calm assurance. "Thank you, Captain, but words won't change what happened. You'll need to ensure that something like this doesn't happen again to anyone, especially not because of assumptions based on my appearance." His voice remained even, but there was a firmness to it, a sense of purpose. "I've been in situations like this too many times before, and the only thing that ever changes is the acknowledgement that something went wrong." Bennett nodded, her eyes reflecting a mixture of understanding and frustration. "You're absolutely right, and I'm going to make sure Robert's actions are reviewed. This kind of profiling has no place in our department." She glanced at Jenkins, her eyes hardening. "We will address this internally. Robert's mistake was serious, and he needs to be held accountable for it." John stood at the doorway, his face pale, the weight of his failure hanging over him. He had believed he was doing his job, following his instincts. But now, in the face of the truth, it was clear to him how far he had gone astray. He had let his assumptions cloud his judgment, and now he was paying the price for it. "Robert, please wait outside," Bennett said, her voice commanding but not unkind. She waited until he left the room before turning back to James. "Mr. Carter, I know this doesn't make up for what you've been through today, but I'm going to make sure this incident is addressed properly. Robert will face the consequences of his actions." James didn't say anything immediately. He had heard the apologies, seen the regret in the officer's eyes. But none of that was enough. It was one thing for the department to acknowledge their mistake. It was another to actually address the underlying issues that had led to this moment. But he was willing to let this play out, if only to make sure that this wasn't just another instance of injustice that would be brushed aside. "Thank you, Captain," he said finally, his voice steady. "But make sure this isn't just about me. There are too many people out there, too many others, who are treated this way. It's bigger than me. I hope this investigation leads to real change." Bennett looked at him, her expression softening. "I hear you, Mr. Carter, and I promise, we will look at this carefully. You're free to go, but we will follow up with you soon. I want to make sure you're informed about the outcome." James gave a small nod of acknowledgement. "I'll be waiting." As James walked out of the office, The weight of the moment hung over him. He knew he had done the right thing by standing his ground. But the truth remained. This was only one instance of many. The city, the system, it was filled with injustices like this. And even though he had won this small victory, it wouldn't be the last time he found himself fighting for fairness. He stepped into the busy hallway of the precinct, feeling the eyes of the officers on him. Some were sympathetic, others unsure of how to react. But James didn't blame them. The system had failed him today. But that failure wasn't theirs to own. It belonged to the ones who had allowed it to continue. Outside the precinct, the crisp air filled his lungs as he stepped into the city's rhythm once more. The world hadn't stopped. But for him, the day had been marked. It was a reminder of how fragile the balance was, how easily it could tip into something far more dangerous. But for now, the battle was over. He had been wronged, and he had been set free. But the work, true change, had only just begun.